Alright, you guys, so I liked the two Capfield books so much that I finished them around the same time, so we're just doing double review day. So, The Good Berry Man. If y'all recall, last week I was like, oh my gosh, Devil's Game, so good, gave backstory. This gives more backstory. This is basically Robert Cage's Attack of the Clones and Revenge of the Sith, like all rolled into one. We get to see how Cage became his own version of Darth Vader. For all y'all nerdy people out there. So this book starts out 16, 17-ish years before books 1 and book 2 in the Capfield series, just based off of Jet Cage's age, when Robert Cage still was a hitman for Mr. Duke and not just Mr. Duke's friend. And like, damn, he's kind of likable. And I think that's a mark of a really good author, when you can make the villains, the antagonists, empathetic, or not make them empathetic, but like make you feel empathy or sympathy for them. It's kind of like you love to hate them because they're just so good. And it's not that, like, in this book Cage's character develops in such a way that you're just like, oh my gosh, she's so maniacal and like clever and stuff. Instead, it's almost the opposite. You see that he starts out as this like relatively naive hitman who just wants to do his job and who wants to be a fearsome hitman. There's this point in the book, I should have marked it, but basically it's about the leather strips that he always leaves and how it's like his mark because he wanted to be some famous feared guy. And you see the blossomings of that, because in books 1 and to a lesser extent book 2, he's already feared. He's confident of himself in the sense that he knows what he wants, to kill his son, and he's determined to do that, and he's not going to let anything stop him. But in this book, you get to see a lot more of his, not necessarily ambivalence, but like the doubts kind of behind some of his actions that he'll eventually take, because as I said, this is like leading up to. So this book mostly focuses on Cage and his work with Mr. Duke, Antonio, who is Vito and Vinny's father, and you see more of Antonio in the first book because they actually go to his hotel to request help, and you hear of him in the second book, but he's really a character here. And so that was also really cool, because even though the story is 100% about Cage, you also get to see kind of how he came to be. You know how they say that you're a combination of the 3 people that you hang around most? I think Mr. Duke gave Cage his like rage and determination to like get stuff done and kill people, whereas Antonio, even though he's also in that world, he's more human. So he kind of impressed upon Cage his humanity. And that's really important, much to his detriment, because during a hit, while they're like researching for a hit, they have to go to this burlesque house called the Peacock, and it's there that he meets Naomi. And we've heard of Naomi before, but this is the first time that we've really like gotten a sense of who she is. And she seems like a really nice girl. She seems like she's just trying to start out and like do her own thing, and she happens to really like the Good Berry Man with owl moon eyes or something like that. They make a big deal about his eyes, and he's called the Good Berry Man because one night, after just being fascinated and infatuated with Naomi, he decides to write in a journal for the first time, and that's kind of the start of all of his journal entries, and that plays into book 1 and 2 later when they're trying to steal Cage's papers and whatnot to try to outsmart him. Anyway, so much of the book, a lot of the book is just Cage courting Naomi behind Mr. Duke's back, because Mr. Duke sees him as a threat, or sees her as a threat, excuse me, and basically says, you need to get rid of her, and if you don't, I will. And here's the crazy thing. He doesn't really, like, stick to that, Mr. Duke, because at one point, they're, like, regularly seeing each other for, like, 6 years. Then they decide to get married. Then they have a kid, Jet, and Naomi doesn't die until Jet's 7. And actually, the description of how she died is just so sad, because she hears this clicking sound and she's like, what is that sound? And she, like, goes upstairs and she happens to see this door to a secret room, and she's like, oh my gosh, Robert's gonna be so excited, he has so many clothes, like, now we have more space. They live in a mansion. Like, I didn't think space would be a problem, but I guess Kate just has a ton of clothes. Anyway, so she, like, goes to open the door and check out the space, and Cage panics and she dies. And then it's even more sad, because Cage is, like, panicking, like, oh my gosh, my wife is dead. And, like, sorry, I don't really see that as too much of a spoiler, because we all know that she's been dead. We've known since book 1. We just didn't know all of the details. Anyway, poor little 7-year-old Jet comes to his parents' room like, what's going on? And sees his father standing over his mother's dead body and just bolts out there. Cage has a bit of a mental breakdown, and he's like, oh my gosh, I need to catch my son before the cops do, because otherwise the cops are going to rat me out. And that's where his homicidal mania against his son begins. So that's the plot. And kind of the interesting thing is, like, right at the end, it switches back to present day, and it's like basically saying that Cage has been terrified, like, all these years, and all of his hits for Mr. Duke threatening his wife, the death of his wife, the hunt for his son, have just been plaguing him every night for years. And he wakes up and he's like, is this a dream? And when he realizes that it's not, he runs to Mr. Duke and he's like, you've got to help me. And Mr. Duke's like, I've already helped you, and all that's happened is that one of my sons gets killed and the other son has a crushed leg. Like, what more can I do? And it's kind of one of the few glimmers of humanity from Mr. Duke, so I think that's really excellent. But enough about the plot. I just think that this is a really interesting book. It's shorter than the other two, and I just really, really enjoyed it because it gave more of that humanity to Cage. It really rounded him out as a character, and it made him more understandable. And even though you're still like, that's really messed up that you want to kill your son, you kind of understand where he's coming from. Like, you may not approve, but you, like, kind of understand where he's coming from. And I think that's just really artfully done. Again, Spiegel, excellent at setting things up. Both Ted's mom, the cop, and Daisy's father, the cop, are brought back. It sounds like they might have been the ones to find Naomi. That's not, like, explicit, but one of them calls the other for, like, a warrant or something. And it's also really interesting because we learn a little bit more about Ted, because in the first book, if y'all remember, Ted's mom, Amy Higgins, she picks up some of the Rat Pack and is like, hey, y'all are juveniles, like, what are you doing in the desert alone? This is not smart. She's really nice to him, and they're like, gee, you're being really nice, like, you're a lot cooler than we thought. And she's like, yeah, well, I have a son about your age, his name's Ted. And kind of that dramatic irony of, like, you as the reader 100% know, and it's not totally clear if the kids know that her Ted is their Ted. But, like, I thought that Ted pulled a Jet and, like, ran off when he was a young kid for whatever reason. Why? I don't know. But in this book, you find out that that's not the case. And I don't want to give that spoiler away, because I'm really hoping that that's explained more in a future book, because as with all the others, it's to be continued. So I know I keep talking about like little plot points a lot, but it's just, it was so interesting because you got that character development, you got the plot points, and it's not that action, it's not action heavy like the first book or even the first-ish part of the second book. There is some action, but it's just really more context. Like you get, excuse me, like you get to see Levi when he's a young kid who's just barely starting to work for Mr. Duke and wants to prove himself, which, like, damn, he started way early. You get to see Mr. Duke more, and you kind of like develop a little bit more of a fear of him, because I think in the first 2 books he's kind of this distant figure where, like, you know he's tough, you know he means business. I mean, he runs a hitman organization, but like this one, he's actually scary. Like, you get to find out how he became in charge of the alleys, and just the Goodberry Man just excellently set up the world of Capfield and gave it so much context. It was great. I read through it in just like a couple of days, just because I kept getting interrupted with like life. But definitely recommend. It's not so much the whole crime and murder and revenge as the other 2 books, which, like, if that's not your cup of tea, then this might be a good place to start. And honestly, like, I know I have a habit of reading books out of order, or book series out of order, but I think if you're going to do that, do it with this book. Because, actually no, don't do it with this book. Because it gives so much context that, like, you do want to read it after, because it helps you better understand the first 2. But by helping you understand the first 2, it needs to come last because of Cage's development primarily, and a little, to a lesser extent, Duke's as well, because like I said, the first book, Cage just seems tough, like he doesn't care. Second book, he's a little bit scared. Third book, you see why he's a little bit scared. You understand him more. And so if you read this book first, I feel like you wouldn't understand Cage as a character nearly as well. Because it would be like, how are you scared and then confident and then sort of scared again? So don't read this out of order, but this is a really good book. This is the Revenge of the Sith of the Capfield series, where we get to see some turning points in characters, and it's really well done. Definitely recommend, and I hope to see you next time. So interrupting real quick, and here's Emily. You finally get to see her face. She's the director. When I was filming this vlog, I forgot to say what book I was reading, and some of that is because I didn't know yet. Because I am going to be working with the Left Hand Valley Courier and Inkberry Books out of Niwot, and I just picked up the next book, so I'll be reviewing A Musical Affair by Carrie Jane Knowles. So keep your eye out for that next week. So happy reading, and thanks.